The NBA playoffs are telling the Pelicans the type of players they need to target in the trade market this offseason. I'll tell you why guys like Karl-Anthony Towns, Trae Young, and others fit so well on the Pelicans based on what we're seeing in the playoffs. It's a Tuesday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Tuesday. Took Monday, Memorial Day off, but we had a bonus show last weekend, so it all works out to being kind of the same thing. And you can kind of hear my voice is a little bit scratchy, but I appreciate y'all for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We are here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. And today we're going to look at a couple lessons from the playoffs. Why a guy like Karl-Anthony Towns fits, why a guy like Trae Young or even DeJounte Murray would fit, and lob threats. You watching that Dallas series, you're seeing the importance of a guy like that. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. We are also available on YouTube, where there's over 10,000 Pelicans fans. So let's get into this. I want to kind of frame this, and I didn't probably do it best in the open, of like lessons we're learning from the playoffs in terms of players you need. And I want to start with the Minnesota Timberwolves. We're going to really look at them. We're really going to look at the Dallas Mavericks and the Boston Celtics. But let's start with the Minnesota Timberwolves. Down 0-3. Down 0-3, likely going to get swept. Look kind of just done in this series. More on that in a second here and why, because I think that's important too. Karl-Anthony Towns feels like kind of an ideal big man to pair next to Zion Williamson. And given they're about to get swept and that they're about to be really expensive and don't look even competitive with the Dallas Mavericks, is he maybe the guy to go and get. This year, he's been playing almost exclusively power forward for the Minnesota Timberwolves, but for the first number of years in his career, for 7-8 years, he was almost exclusively a center, and a shooting center at that, who also gives you rebounding. And for the Pelicans, that's kind of an ideal situation. This is a guy who, for his career, is a 40% shooter from three on over 4 attempts per game. It rises even more so as you get a little bit later in his career after that rookie year where he didn't really take many three-point attempts. Since his rookie year, it's about 5 attempts per game. He even has a season where he took almost 8 attempts per game and shot 41.2%. You need to space the court in the playoffs. One of the things you're seeing from these really good teams, the Dallas Mavericks, the Boston Celtics, is the court is spaced for their star players. It's vitally important. That is why the Pelicans have wanted to shoot more threes and have had target numbers for that, because that's going to help you space the court. That if you're launching them in volume, teams eventually have to respect that a little bit. It's also part of the reason why we wanted to maybe get Trae Young into the starting lineup in place of Herb Jones, or if there's a Brandon Ingram trade. Getting Karl-Anthony Towns, who maybe just needs a change of scenery, could be a really good plan for New Orleans in terms of just finding the right type of big man to put next to Zion Williamson. They're looking for a unicorn type of player. There's not many that kind of check all of the boxes that they need of rim protection, shooting, rebounding. Karl-Anthony Towns gives you 2 of those things. He doesn't give you much defense, and more on how his style of play in a second. But those are 2 big ones, rebounding and the offense that he gives you. And I think that could be a really useful thing to add to this Pelicans team. He's not an elite rebounder, but he's good enough rebounder, I think. And given that he wasn't closing game 2, he's had sometimes limited minutes in this postseason run here in this series. Maybe it just leads to the Timberwolves feeling they need to move on from him. And they're more likely to move on from him, I think, than Rudy Gobert, who just won Defensive Player of the Year. Their identity as a team is on the defensive side of the ball. They want to get stops and try and get out and run in transition, the number one defense in the league. Towns doesn't really help you with that. But let me ask you this. So Towns might fit perfectly in terms of the type of player he is. Like, we don't need to spend that much time talking about Karl-Anthony Towns, right? You know what he's capable of doing. He says he's the best shooting big man of all time. It's Dirk, but he's probably in that conversation at the very least. One of the things, though, is, do you trust him? Do you trust him when it counts? Look at this series between the Dallas Mavericks and the Minnesota Timberwolves. And one of the lessons from this, and this is something I really, if you're a longtime listener, a longtime everydayer, you know what I'm probably going to say here, right? It comes down to your star players. Luka and Kyrie are getting it done. Karl-Anthony Towns, Anthony Edwards are not for the Minnesota Timberwolves, and they're struggling. If those two play well, this could be a series, but they aren't. Do you trust Towns in big moments? Do you trust Towns in the playoffs? I'm not sure that I do. One of the things you notice when he plays is that dude just makes some dumb freaking plays. Just dumb plays, dumb fouls, dumb turnovers that you kind of look at him and go like, what are you thinking? Is that going to work with head coach Willie Green, or is that an absolute disaster in the making? It easily could be a disaster. And if Willie Green gets a guy like this and is like absolutely not going to play him, he has bad fouls, dumb turnovers, you end up in a really negative situation here. So you only make this move if you really get your head coach buying into this is a key guy for us. And obviously it would be. It's Karl-Anthony Towns. And you've got to play him no matter what. And maybe we need to kind of balance, and that's what it's about, balance the offense and the defense a little bit more. But Towns could be available. But star players also need to carry you, and that's how you win in the postseason. Boston's winning one a little bit because of their depth, but mainly their star players. Really as simple as that. For the Indiana Pacers, their star players didn't show up. That's what this comes down to. That's why that first round series against the Oklahoma City Thunder, when Zion didn't play, they didn't really have a chance. Shea showed up. Zion didn't play. B.I. struggled. It was done at that point. Would we have liked it to be closer than a sweep? Yeah. But also keep that kind of context in mind with it. With a healthy Zion, things look at least different. I don't know if they look good, but they look different, and I think that's worth pointing out here. Would you trust Karl-Anthony Towns? I don't know if there's many other stretch big men that you can get, stretch fives, that you could put out there on the court next to Zion. I'd throw almost like everything. Brandon Ingram and a bunch of picks to go get Karl-Anthony Towns. They're likely also not going to trade Gobert given all that they gave up for him, and you wouldn't be able to trade him for nearly as much. And that then looks bad. But coming up next, what about a creator? Look at what Luka and Kyrie are doing. Do the Pelicans need a guard like that? Is there one available? Let's look at that coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. You want to get in on the Brandon Ingram sweepstakes. Do you think that those are good odds for the Orlando Magic? More on one of their players later in the show, by the way. Or is that not who it's going to be? It's going to be the 76ers. It's going to be the Timberwolves. You can get in on that action over at FanDuel. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Again, that's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more with any winning $5 bet. FanDuel, official sportsbook of Locked On. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans brought to you by the NOLA Star Bar. I want to invite you there, because it's right down the street from the Smoothie King Center for all your pre- and post-game libations. And they play every Pelicans home and away game throughout the season. And they've also got the NBA playoffs there. We're almost in the finals. Go watch them at NOLA Star Bar. They have a pool table, video poker, an internet jukebox, and karaoke every Wednesday night. They also feature over 100 worldwide spirits and a hefty selection of local beers. They are a true Pelicans fans bar. They even created and produced the Pelicans anthem, Fly Pelicans Fly, complete with a music video. So join your fellow Pelicans fans at NOLA Star Bar at 212 Loyola Avenue, open 7 days a week, 6 p.m. to 4 a.m., and check out their Pelicans anthem on the NOLA Star Bar YouTube page. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We are here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. For your second listen, go check out Locked On Saints. Ross Jackson making sense of minicamp, making sense of the new offense that Derek Carr is raving about. Maybe something will make him good. Will he be good next year? How many touchdowns? How many interceptions will he throw? Ross Jackson covering it all over at the Locked On Saints podcast. So let's keep talking about what we're seeing from the playoffs and how to use that to make smart decisions on the trade market. This team needs a creator. They need another creator. Zion has court gravity and is a creator. You put the ball in his hands, he draws two to the ball. Draws a double team, triple team, quadruple team. And that's important. You need to manufacture open looks for others. Brandon Ingram in the postseason didn't do that. Did not do that because he likes that mid-range shot, and that's what teams want. So they're happy to let him get it. That doesn't create for others. He was never double-teamed in that series against the Oklahoma City Thunder. He didn't do anything to warrant a double team. So you need someone like that. And if the Pelicans are going to trade Brandon Ingram, one of the things I've said is you're either looking to get back a center or a guard or a creator, right? One or the other. We're going to look at big men in the next segment here. And the more you look at that market, the more you feel the Pelicans should go after a guard if they're going to trade Brandon Ingram, unless you can get a guy like Karl-Anthony Towns. Because this is so important. Look at the Minnesota series with the Dallas Mavericks here. Luka and Kyrie are just torching that Minnesota defense, the #1 defense. They look really good. Now, I think this is a very poor matchup for the Timberwolves just in the first place, and sometimes it comes down to that. But Luka Doncic is doing some incredible things in this series, and so is Kyrie Irving. And when you look at how they're playing, that goes a long way towards these guys in the postseason in this series creating for others. It's why guys like Derek Lively II are wide open, and he has not missed a single shot in this series, right? Derek Jones Jr. is also playing incredibly well. Daniel Gafford is shooting well, even if his plus-minus doesn't look good. These are guys that are just kind of getting things done because of the other guys on this team creating wide open looks for them, Luka and Kyrie. In this series alone, Luka has 26 assists. Kyrie is the secondary guy, has 14. It's 40 assists between them in 3 games. Those are really good numbers, and they're creating open looks for their teammates. Pelicans have one guy that does that in Zion Williamson. They need another one. This is why they're looking at a guy like Trae Young, DeJounte Murray, Darius Garland. Why they'll ask about Donovan Mitchell. Well, they'll ask about basically everybody that's available because you need something like this. This also goes back to the idea of a point guard. I don't know if it's like a true point guard that they need, right? If you bring in an aging Chris Paul to this team, is he still able to create advantages for you in ways that he did when he was in his prime? Would it be a nice reunion? Yes, absolutely. And I would love to see him retired in this uniform. But he's not the same player that he once was. I don't think he's horrible, but for averaging 7 assists last season, 9 the year before that, that's not bad numbers, but are those the numbers you need here? And I don't think it is. You need someone that can also score and be a threat too. And he just kind of doesn't have that in him. But these creators are so important. So important. A guard that can initiate. And we've seen CJ as more of an off-ball guy. That's not it, right? Like, that's not it. You need a guy that draws to the ball. CJ can relocate, can create open shots. When he drives and attacks, that's not it. We'll talk more about him coming off the bench soon, though. Maybe as soon as tomorrow. Actually, let's just do that in tomorrow's show. I like that show. That'll be an interesting one. So you need to find that kind of creator. It's likely going to be a guard. I'm sure they'll look at the point guard market, but you have a second chance at an aging Kyle Lowry again. I don't know if that's really the move. Russell Westbrook is potentially going to be available or available for trade. Not sure if that's the way to go. James Harden's rumored to be unhappy in LA. I don't think that's necessarily the move, though. If he finds any semblance of his old form, that actually wouldn't be the worst fit on this team. I just don't think he's the same kind of player that he once was and had a very strange season. 16 points, 8.5 assists. But if you get him from his final year in Philly, where he only played 58 games, 21 points, 11 assists, that's the type of James Harden on, 38, 39% from three on 7 attempts. You could kind of convince me of that. He did those numbers, 21 points on 14.5 shots per game. I'm kind of liking this idea a little bit here. Let me know what you think about James Harden down below. But you need someone on the perimeter that's a threat, that can create. Look at how many wide open lobs the Dallas Mavericks have because the threat that Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving present to that defense. Right? Gafford's wide open, Lively the second's wide open, PJ Washington is getting them and throwing them down. That's a really needed thing for this Pelicans team. When Zion's not out there, they just don't have creation. It's not Brandon Ingram. He can lead you in assists. He can get assists, but it's not necessarily by making creating wide open looks for others. And so when you look at his assist numbers, what are those truly representative of? And I don't think it's representative necessarily of his style of play. So they need to find that. I think these playoffs have shown you need that kind of creation on the perimeter being important. You can look at the Dallas Mavericks and they don't have, a full on, they have Drew Holiday kind of being their traditional point guard, right? But Drew even at times is a little bit more of a combo guard too, depending on kind of the role that he's playing for that team. And Jason Tatum had more assists per game than Drew Holiday did. So when you look at those type of guys, Tatum can dish the ball. Jaylen Brown can dish the ball a little bit. Derek White was probably closest to their point guard. He led that team in assists. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander isn't a traditional point, but because he attacks and drives, that opens things up and he's able to create for others as well as him shooting threes. Those are the type of players the Pelicans need to get on this team. So it probably rules out a guy like Russell Westbrook because whatever guard you're going to get needs to shoot threes. How did Chris Paul do past couple of years shooting threes? I don't think they were particularly great, right? Let's pull those numbers up and take a look. They're probably not bad. I probably said that, and it's going to be like he's an amazing three-point shooter still. He shot, not amazing, 37% on 3.6 attempts last year, 38% his final year in Phoenix. The second to last year in Phoenix, just 32% from three. So it's still a little bit of a mixed bag. I think if you could get him for dirt cheap, great reunion, great story. Have him coming off the bench would be good. But other than that, they need to maybe set their sights a little bit bigger. Trae Young's probably, again, in my opinion, the ideal guy. Him or Donovan Mitchell. Those are guys that teams are scared of. Plus, Trae is a good lob thrower, and I think that shows you the value of those guys when you have such offensive threats. Get guys who can do that. You don't see a lot of lobs on the Pelicans because no one other than Zion is really a lob threat. And that's pretty disappointing. So speaking of lob threats, I got some names that you can look at that you might be able to fill that role for cheap. And that kind of ties into how the Pelicans are probably going to approach the center position. And it's maybe not going to be in the way that you think. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We are here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want, looking at a variety of trade targets and looking at lessons learned from the postseason right now. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and available on YouTube. And now, are you watching Fox Sports, ESPN, or something else all day long? Do you have to turn down the volume with all the shouting, the yelling that you're hearing, the non-sports talk? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the yelling. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So we just went over that I think the Pelicans should trade Brandon Ingram for a guard for creation. You see that in the postseason. They desperately need that. Absolutely do. That means then you probably need to address the center position another way. And that way is probably going to be by committee because you don't have tons of money to spend in free agency on a big name guy. We'd all like Nick Claxton. They don't have $20 million to spend in free agency on him. They just simply won't be able to get him. It's kind of that simple. Naz Reid probably isn't going to be moved as the reigning sixth man of the year from the Minnesota Timberwolves, but we'll talk about him in the future. you're going to have to do this kind of cobbling together a couple of different guys. But those guys exist. And here's the great thing about this. You don't need those guys to be elite because they're your fifth starter. They're your fifth starter. You're going to have your new, say, guard, CJ, Trey, Herb, center, something like that. Zion's in there too. Maybe not Trey. We'll see. It just depends. Maybe CJ comes off the bench. Let's look at that tomorrow. So we'll go new guard, Trey, Herb, Zion, center. There we go. Let's say that's it. I don't think that's going to be it, but let's say. You can do the center position kind of cheap and just have guys with different skill sets that give you different things. And I think a lot of those guys exist. I think you can go out and get a couple of those guys right now. We've heard about Wendell Carter Jr. potentially being moved from the Orlando Magic. That's a guy who has an uncertain future there. He fits a lot of that. 3-point shooting, rim protection. He's mobile. That's important too. I'd love to see Zion Williamson with a more mobile center, an above the rim threat center. Vertical spacing, I think, gets overused as a term. 3-point spacing is way more important than that, but a lob threat is good. We've never seen Zion play with a lob threat to see if he can actually, throw lobs to those guys. And when you draw double teams like he does, I feel like he'll be able to. Like, I really do. You put Trae Young on this team and a couple of cheap lob threats out there too as just centers to rotate in and out. I feel pretty good about what you'd be able to see there. That's two guys that draw double teams more so than anyone else on this roster. That would be a lot of fun. So you have Wendell Carter Jr. What about Robert Williams? Time Lord is his nickname over on the Portland Trailblazers. I think that could be a decent option for this Pelicans team too. That is an above the rim kind of guy. James Wiseman could be a super cheap buy low option. I don't think he's particularly good, but he doesn't really have a future, it feels like, in Detroit at all. So maybe you can go out and try and get him and see if you can just have a bit of a reclamation project here. He's got a team option for he's a free agent. So you could absolutely go and try and sign him. He's a restricted free agent, but you could try and sign him and see if you could bring him in. I don't think he's going to get very big money anywhere. I think he's going to kind of go a Jackson Hayes route, which is that sort of like near vet minimum deal. For Detroit, he played in 63 games, averaged 7 points and 5 rebounds. It wasn't anything particularly special, but there's a little bit of defense there. He's a big dude. That's important too. He can get up. He's young. Pelicans have had some luck with things like that, going and playing Christian Wood kind of as a reclamation project. Jahlil Okafor is another one that was a bit of a reclamation project too, that things seem to work out really well with. The ideal certainly in this case would be Jarrett Allen, but I don't think if you're trading Brandon Ingram for a guard, that you're going to be able to get Jarrett Allen unless it's a package deal for Allen and Darius Garland, in which case I'm really intrigued by what this team's going to be capable of doing. But the lob threat, just giving an easy outlet to those guards, to your creators. Just right there, just loft it up to them when you draw two to the ball by the rim. Shows you the purpose, the need for attacking the basket and getting down low. Collapsing that defense on you just to the side is going to leave that lane right wide open for a rim running big man to go and get the ball. And that in turn then, when you do that and they're worried about that, either opens things up for Zion or your other players, or even opens 3-point shots for your shooters up too. So there's ways that you could really make this work. Again, could you get both Robert Williams and Wendell Carter Jr.? Yeah, absolutely. Could you sign James Wiseman and trade for, Wendell Carter Jr.? Absolutely. Could you get Jarrett Allen and also sign James Wiseman? Yes. Or trade for Jarrett Allen and Robert Williams? I think so. So if you package all of that together, you end up with a center position that you're not spending too much money on, especially if you go and get some of the cheaper guys, but that's still going to be effective for you because they're filling that kind of dive man role. And then you can run pick and rolls with them. They're your fifth starter. You don't need them to do a whole lot. And I think that's where you could look at this and go, that's likely what the Pelicans are going to need to do. I don't think they're going to be able to get Karl-Anthony Towns, right? Darius Garland's probably the most gettable out of all of the guys we've mentioned here. You bring him in. Okay, let's put him with some, he's not a really great lob thrower, but let's put him with some lob throwing centers. Maybe they can get better at that. Maybe those guys in their ups can go and get the ball and it ends up working out okay. That could be fun to pair with CJ with a second unit too. Let those two guys kind of cook. We saw the CJ Valanciunas 3 shooters lineup And that seemed to work pretty well for the Pelicans at times this year, even if they went away from it towards the end of the season. More on that in tomorrow's show when we talk about CJ off the bench. So all of those things, I think, are how you can remake this roster and look at what's working in the postseason and use that as your blueprint. It's all out there waiting for you to just emulate it, right? Go and do what's working in the postseason. This is why in years past, and we'll probably end up doing them this year too, I've done shows where it's like, what can you learn from the Phoenix Suns? What can you learn from the Denver Nuggets? All of those things, I think, are what teams do, by the way. I've explained a little bit about kind of how the front office works with some of the delegation of work and things like that. I think I explained that, you have a room of people. And it's like, everyone, we're trying to find a big man. Come in with your trades tomorrow for work and show us what deals you think would get approved. And like, let's see if we can, if any of, of 10 deals get thrown out here, we like these two, let's start working on those. A lot of it is also doing research around the league. What are other teams doing? What makes this team so successful? Particularly when you've had a bad season and you're in the lottery, they tend to kind of review, okay, teams with a top 5 pick that made the playoffs 2 years ago but now didn't, what teams got into the postseason the next year, and what can we learn from that? That's a lot of the work that gets done. There's just like notebooks and like dossiers and binders filled with information and stuff like that. They're doing that work right now, so we'll do some of it too on Locked On Pelicans, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans. Thank you all so much for listening. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. I'll be back with you all tomorrow. We'll talk about CJ McCollum coming off the bench for the New Orleans Pelicans next season.